Most people here would agree that international donors have had a great deal of influence on the Palestinians. I think I'm speaking to a room that'll agree with this. So recently I carried out a study that focused on the perceptions of 9 of the major donors. I did this at the University of Bath. I looked at the period 2010 to 2016, and I looked at about 80 of their reports. I did a keyword analysis. I looked at how many certain words I looked for. I counted how many times they were mentioned, and then how they were used. I'll get into what some of those keywords were. First, it's very important to note, why would I look at the reports, and why would I look at the donor aid reports? Because they're political. Those reports reflect what the donors think about Palestine and how they perceive Palestine. The 9 Western donors I looked at were the United States, so the dominant political force, the European Union. I also looked at multilaterals like the World Bank and IMF that have had a great influence on Palestine. Canada, the UK, Norway, Sweden, and Germany. These donors, out of the, let's say, 35, maybe it's reaching $40 billion now that they've spent on what I call Oslo aid since 1993. Those donors account for, out of that 35 billion, 15 billion. So every $7 spent, 3 were spent by these 9 donors. They have a great deal of influence on the overall model of development aid in Palestine. So I conducted this study to better understand how these donors perceive the Oslo peace process, Palestinian development, Israeli military rule, the ongoing colonization of Palestine, and I can tell you they never refer to it as colonization, and just how these processes work together. This was all carried out using, I used very terminology that those donors are familiar with. I looked at it through 8 effectiveness principles, and all of these donors have agreed to these principles. So the Paris Declaration and the Accra Agenda for Action, but also common knowledge of fragile states, on how you should give money in a fragile state. We'll call Palestine a fragile state. I would call it a settler colonial situation, but for the donors, you could refer to this as a fragile state. So I'm going to focus on a few of those keywords from this study, and the first one really refers to the strength of analysis. Do the donors really recognize the situation in Palestine when they're looking at Palestine? So what stood out of with reviewing the reporting by the donors is how they perceive the situation here. Strong analysis on the context of a fragile and conflicted state, again, a terminology they would agree to for Palestine, is critical for a donor to avoid doing harm. In other words, you need to know what you're doing if you're not going to harm it. It's like being a doctor. You need to know what your patient's condition is. You need to know how to treat that condition before you get involved. And donor aid is equally complex. It's been referred to as being as complex as neurosurgery. So strong analysis was not always common amongst the donors, and this is particularly the case for the ones based in North America. So the United States, Canada, and I also lumped the IMF and World Bank into here because they're based in Washington, D.C., and you see this common theme. This can be observed in the way they account for the most key processes undermining Palestinian daily life, what contributes to poverty here, the human rights situation, and the occupation and colonization of Palestine. So the key words I focused on for this point are, do those donors use the words occupied, occupation, settlements, settlers, and colonization? And I think we should agree that they should all use the words occupation, occupied, settlers, and settlements, right? This is pretty much the problem for Palestinians. Let's say 1967 Palestine right now. So starting with Canada, I looked at even more reports for Canada because the reports were wanting on information. There wasn't much information in them. Canada never referred to there being an occupation, settlers, settlements, or colonization in 2 types of reports. From 1998 to 2016, their official statistical reports on development assistance, and from 2008 to 2016, in their reports to Parliament on official development aid. So Canada, so again, the strong analysis is you should recognize what the main problems are, and Canada wasn't even referring to there being an occupation. Likewise, so that was about 1,000 pages, but that's looking at all of Canada's international aid. For the US Government Accountability Office, in about 160 pages from reports from 2010 to 15, the words occupation, settlers, settlements, or colonization are almost never mentioned. Although the IMF did reference settlements a modest 31 times across 587 pages and 16 reports to the AHLC from 2010 to 2017, this averages slightly less than 2 mentions of settlements per report. So the AHLC, most people should know it, it's where the donors meet twice per year in order to discuss Palestinian development aid and how they're going to fund and what they're going to spend, and most of the big donors attend this. The IMF and World Bank and the Quartet all give reports there, and other donors as well. The other terms for the IMF, occupation, settlers, and colonization, are basically not mentioned in the IMF reporting, except for a footnote. So once they reference, footnotes are important sometimes. They reference an UNRWA report with the word occupied in the title. And that might have been their way of breaking that barrier. The World Bank, it might be the intellectual driver of Palestinian development and defining what kind of funding you're going to get and what kind of programs you're going to have funded. It generally does a better job than Canada, the US, and IMF at assessing what the context is. Generally, it's not the best donor, but it's better than Canada, the US, and the IMF. So in 739 pages, in 19 reports that I reviewed from 2009 to 2017, largely written for the HLC, the bank never mentioned colonization except for once. And this is the only time any donor I looked at mentioned it once. And it was probably by accident, because it was a report from Maz, where they had a title of the report, The Economic Base of Israel's Colonial Settlements in the West Bank. But for the World Bank, it might be quite controversial even to put that name of a report from Maz into this footnote of their report. The World Bank also mentioned the word settlers 19 times and settlements 68 times. So this is over many years. They only mentioned them, though, in they only mentioned the word settler in 5 of their 19 reports. And references to settlements are only made in half of the reports. So this is your most important analyst for the international community of what kind of development aid you should be getting. They're designing development aid where they almost never use the word settlers and settlements. In the largest of the bank's reports, I reviewed one, a 239-page report that covered the years 2001 and to 2009. It only mentions the settlers 3 times and settlements twice. And this is in spite of the settlements growing perhaps faster in this period than at any other period of time. Meanwhile, the bank rarely mentioned that there's an occupation or occupied territory, even though both are internationally accepted terms. Further, those references to the term occupation often came up from a reference to a report title, like I mentioned before. And references to the occupation almost completely disappear after the year 2012. So if you're reading the World Bank reporting after 2012, you might not know there's an occupation of Palestine. So the result of reading those 4 donors' reports is that you might think, oh, things are going well, the occupation's pretty much ended in Palestine, or there's other problems for poverty in Palestine. So this contrasts with the Europeans. The Europeans were much more likely to use the contextually accurate terminology when describing Palestine. Although the Norwegians rarely mentioned settlers and settlements across 236 pages of reporting, they did mention the occupation 116 times and occupied 27 times. So if you're reading the Norwegian reporting, you realize occupation is a problem. With the EU, it referenced settlers not often in 199 pages of reporting from 2000, and I only looked at 2 years, 2014 to 2015, but they referred to settlements 57 times, occupation 72 times, and occupied 163 times. So it's impossible to forget the context when you're reading the European reporting. In only 199 pages, they basically mentioned Palestine is occupied on every single page. The Swedish reporting was particularly sophisticated. I looked at 183 pages from 2012 to 2015. Again, they didn't reference settlers a lot, 8 times. They did mention settlements 33 times. They mentioned the occupation 53 times and occupied 41 times. And the UK stood out compared to Canada and the US. In 32 pages from 2011 to 2015, they referred to the settlers 12 times, settlements 17 times, occupation 7 times, and occupied 11 times. Okay, I gave a lot of statistics and we're all like, what this guy's talking about, right? The main point is the Europeans always mention that there's settlers, settlements, and an occupation. When you look at the reporting, it reflects that the Europeans understand the situation here, and you don't lose sight of the main problem in Palestine, settlements and occupied. With the North Americans, they don't look at occupation as the problem. How am I doing for time? Fantastic. So I'm going to look at one other terminology then, human rights. I'm sorry I'm going to give numbers again like this. The study is up in Arabic. Aid Watch Palestine was able to get money to translate it to Arabic, so you can look at all of the breakdown. But looking at the US, they did not mention Palestinian economic rights in any of their reports. And of the 10 times they mentioned human rights, 4 were about Israeli human rights when they were talking about Palestinian development. The Canadians likewise did not mention Palestinian economic rights. They only reference human rights vaguely a few times, like we like human rights. The IMF brought up human rights once and economic rights 9 times. Once again, the World Bank shows more nuance with 18 references to human rights and 9 to economic rights. This is still relatively little for a conflict that's defined by extreme violence and human rights abuses, and one in which the peace-building model has been connected to economic growth. So what you're seeing with the North American-based donors is that they don't really want to talk about human rights, and even though the entire Palestinian development model is based on economic rights and economic growth, they don't want to talk about economic rights. It's even remarkable that the IMF and World Bank hardly talk about economic rights. By contrast, Norway, and it was about 200 pages of reporting, referred to human rights 214 times. So Norway clearly saw human rights as an issue for Palestine. The EU, in 2 years of reporting and 199 pages, referred to human rights 400 times. So this is more than all of many more times than all of Canada, the US, and IMF combined in much less reporting. Meanwhile, the EU referenced economic rights 30 times. Again, the UK is different than its North American cousins, referring to human rights in 32 pages 49 times. The UK was not concerned about economic rights. The Swedes displayed a deep concern for human rights, referring to human rights 511 times. So the common point again is that amongst the donors, the Europeans are very clearly concerned about the human rights situation in Palestine, and economic rights doesn't play in as much. The North American ones, World Bank, IMF, US, Canada, they're not going to mention human rights more than they have to, and the US, of course, was concerned about Israeli human rights in talking about Palestinian development. So I looked at a lot more keywords like that in the report. You can look up for, and I also made profiles of the 9 different donors in this report. I also interviewed about 40 policymakers from the different countries, and I wrote up an analysis of what they thought about the situation in Palestine. And there was a gap. You could see North Americans, and I often found this with some Canadians, or especially when they had quit their job recently, they'd clearly understood what was happening in Palestine, but what they wrote in the reports reflected the politics. And the politics was, for the North Americans, you need to stay away from words that are sensitive like occupation, occupied, settlements, and human rights. So there's a bit of nuance here amongst the donors. We can see that the Europeans have more promise. The problem is, and I think Muriel got to this the Europeans are really just going to follow the United States, and they're just hoping and waiting that there's a new administration in the US and it will take a different approach. But the problem is in the US and in Canada, the World Bank and the IMF, these real determinants of Palestinian development aid, they refuse to acknowledge what the situation really is, and in the process, they contribute to making this situation worse in Palestine. Thanks.